It was very late, after my sister had fallen asleep. I can remember it as if it were yesterday. He came in from the courtyard, opening the French doors without a sound. A tall, fair-skinned man with a mass of blonde hair and a graceful, almost feline quality to his movements. And gently he draped a shawl over my sister's eyes and lowered the wick of the lamp. She dozed there beside the basin and the cloth with which she'd bathed my forehead, and she never once stirred under that shawl until morning. But by that time I was greatly changed. "What was this change?" asked the boy. The vampire sighed. He leaned back against the chair and looked at the walls. "At first I thought he was another doctor, or someone summoned by the family to try to reason with me, but this suspicion was removed at once." He stepped close to my bed and leaned down so that his face was in the lamplight, and I saw that he was no ordinary man at all. His grey eyes burned with an incandescence, and the long white hands which hung by his sides were not those of a human being. I think I knew everything in that instance, and all that he told me was only aftermath. What I mean is, the moment I saw him, saw his extraordinary aura, and knew him to be no creature I'd ever known, I was reduced to nothing. That ego which could not accept the presence of an extraordinary human being in its midst was crushed. All my conceptions, even my guilt and wish to die, seemed utterly unimportant. "I completely forgot myself," he said, now silently touching his breast with his fist. "I forgot myself totally, and in the same instant knew totally the meaning of possibility. From then on I experienced only increasing wonder, as he talked to me and told me of what I might become, and of what his life had been and stood to be. My past shrank to embers. I saw my life as if I stood apart from it. The vanity, the self-serving, the constant fleeing from one petty annoyance after another, the lip service to God and the Virgin and a host of saints whose names filled my prayer books, none of whom made the slightest difference in a narrow, materialistic, selfish existence. I saw my real gods, the gods of most men, food, drink, and security and conformity. Cinders." The boy's face was tense with a mixture of confusion and amazement. "And so you decided to become a vampire?" he asked. The vampire was silent for a moment. "Decided. It doesn't seem the right word. Yet I cannot say it was inevitable from the moment that he stepped into that room. No, indeed, it was not inevitable. Yet I can't say I decided. Let me say that when he'd finished speaking, no other decision was possible for me, and I pursued my course without a backward glance. Except for one." "Except for one? What?" "My last sunrise," said the vampire. "That morning I was not yet a vampire, and I saw my last sunrise. I remember it completely, yet I do not think I remember any other sunrise before it. I remember the light came first to the tops of the French windows, a paling behind the lace curtains, and then a gleam growing brighter and brighter in patches among the leaves of the trees. Finally the sun came through the windows themselves, and the lace lay in shadows on the stone floor, and all over the form of my sister, who was still sleeping, shadows of lace on the shawl over her shoulders and head. As soon as she was warm, she pushed the shawl away without awakening, and then the sun shone full on her eyes, and she tightened her eyelids. Then it was gleaming on the table where she rested her head on her arms, and gleaming, blazing in the water in the pitcher. And I could feel it on my hands, on the counterpane, and then on my face. I lay in the bed thinking about all the things the vampire had told me. And then it was that I had said goodbye to the sunrise and went out to become a vampire. It was the last sunrise." The vampire was looking out the window again, and when he stopped, the silence was so sudden the boy seemed to hear it. Then he could hear the noise from the street. The sound of a truck was deafening. The light cord stirred with the vibration. Then the truck was gone. "Do you miss it?" he asked then in a small voice. "Not really," said the vampire. "There are so many other things. But where are we? You want to know how it happened, how I became a vampire." "Yes," said the boy. "How did you change exactly?" "I can't tell you exactly," said the vampire. "I can tell you about it, enclose it with words that will make the value of it more evident to you, but I can't tell you exactly, any more than I could tell you exactly what is the experience of sex if you've never had it." The young man seemed struck suddenly with still another question, but before he could speak, the vampire went on. "As I told you, this vampire, Lestat, wanted the plantation. A mundane reason, surely, for granting me a life which will last until the end of the world, but he was not a very discriminating person. He didn't consider the world's small population of vampires as being a select club, I should say. He had human problems, a blind father who did not know his son was a vampire and must not find out. Living in New Orleans had become too difficult for him, considering his needs and the necessity to care for his father, and he wanted Point du Lac. We went at once to the plantation the next evening, ensconced the blind father in the master bedroom, and I proceeded to make the change. I cannot say that it consisted in any one step really, though one, of course, was the step beyond which I could make no return. But there were several acts involved, and the first was the death of the overseer. Lestat took him in his sleep. I was to watch and to approve, that is, to witness the taking of a human life as proof of my commitment and part of my change. This proved without doubt the most difficult part for me. I've told you I had no fear regarding my own death, only a squeamishness about taking my life myself. But I had a most high regard for the life of others, and a horror of death most recently developed because of my brother. I had to watch the overseer awake with a start, try to throw off Lestat with both hands, fail, then lie there struggling under Lestat's grasp, and finally go limp, drained of blood, and die. He did not die at once. We stood in his narrow bedroom for the better part of an hour watching him die. Part of my change, as I said. Lestat would never have stayed otherwise. Then it was necessary to get rid of the overseer's body. I was almost sick from this, weak and feverish already. I had little reserve, and handling the dead body with such a purpose caused me nausea. Lestat was laughing, telling me callously that I would feel so different once I was a vampire, that I would laugh too. He was wrong about that. I never laugh at death, no matter how often and regularly I am the cause of it. But let me take things in order. We had to drive up the river road until we came to open fields and leave the overseer there. We tore his coat, stole his money, and saw to it his lips were stained with liquor. I knew his wife, who lived in New Orleans, and knew the state of desperation she would suffer when the body was discovered. But more than sorrow for her, I felt pain that she would never know what had happened, that her husband had not been found drunk on the road by robbers. As we beat the body, bruising the face and the shoulders, I became more and more aroused. Of course, you must realize that all this time the vampire Lestat was extraordinary. He was no more human to me than a biblical angel, but under this pressure, my enchantment with him was strained. I had seen my becoming a vampire in two lights. The first light was simply enchantment. Lestat had overwhelmed me on my deathbed. But the other light was my wish for self-destruction, my desire to be thoroughly damned. This was the door through which Lestat had come on both the first and second occasion. Now I was not destroying myself, but someone else, the overseer, his wife, his family. I recoiled and might have fled from Lestat, my sanity thoroughly shattered, had not he sensed with an infallible instinct what was happening. Infallible instinct, the vampire mused. Let me say the powerful instinct of a vampire to whom even the slightest change in a human's facial expression is as apparent as a gesture. Lestat had preternatural timing. He rushed me into the carriage and whipped the horses home. I want to die, I began to murmur. This is unbearable. I want to die. You have it in your power to kill me. Let me die. I refused to look at him, to be spellbound by the sheer beauty of his appearance. He spoke my name to me softly, laughing. As I said, he was determined to have the plantation. But would he have let you go? Asked the boy. Under any circumstances? I don't know. Knowing Lestat as I do now, I would say he would have killed me rather than let me go. But this was what I wanted, you see. It didn't matter. No, this was what I thought I wanted. As soon as we reached the house, I jumped down out of the carriage and walked, a zombie, to the brick stairs where my brother had fallen. The house had been unoccupied for months now. The overseer having his own cottage, and the Louisiana heat and damp were already picking apart the steps. Every crevice was sprouting grass, and even small wildflowers. I remember feeling the moisture which in the night was cool as I sat down on the lower steps, and even rested my head against the brick and felt the little wax-stemmed wildflowers with my hands. I pulled a clump of them out of the easy dirt in one hand. I want to die. Kill me. Kill me, I said to the vampire. Now I am guilty of murder. I can't live. He sneered with the impatience of people listening to the obvious lies of others. And then in a flash he fastened on me just as he had been on the man. I thrashed against him wildly. I dug my boot into his chest and kicked him as fiercely as I could, his teeth stinging my throat, the fever pounding in my temples, and with a movement of his entire body, much too fast for me to see, he was suddenly standing disdainfully at the foot of the steps. I thought you wanted to die, Louis, he said. The boy made a soft, abrupt sound when the vampire said his name, which the vampire acknowledged with a quick statement. Yes, that is my name, and went on. Well, I lay there helpless in the face of my own cowardice and fatuousness again. He said, perhaps so directly confronted with it, I might in time have gained the courage to truly take my life, not to whine and beg for others to take it. I saw myself turning on a knife then, languishing in day-to-day suffering which I found as necessary as penance from the confessional, truly hoping death would find me, unawares, and render me fit for eternal pardon. And also I saw myself as if in a vision standing at the head of the stairs just where my brother had stood, and then hurtling my body down on the bricks. But there was no time for courage. Or shall I say, there was no time in Lestat's plan for anything but his plan. Now listen to me, Louis, he said, and he lay down beside me now on the steps, his movements so graceful and so personal that at once it made me think of a lover. I recoiled. But he put his arm around me and pulled me close to his chest. Never had I seen him this close before, and in the dim light I could see the magnificent radiance of his eyes and the unnatural mask of his skin. As I tried to move, he pressed his right fingers against my lips and said, "Be still. I am going to drain you now to the very threshold of death, and I want you to be quiet, so quiet that you can almost hear the flow of blood through your veins, so quiet that you can hear the flow of that same blood through mine. It is your consciousness, your will, which must be kept alive." I wanted to struggle, but he pressed so hard with his fingers that he held my entire prone body in check. And as soon as I stopped my abortive attempt at rebellion, he sank his teeth into my neck. The boy's eyes grew huge. He had drawn farther and farther back in his chair as the vampire spoke, and now his face was tense, his eyes narrow, as if he were preparing to weather a blow. "Have you ever lost a great amount of blood?" asked the vampire. "Do you know the feeling?" The boy's lips shaped the word no, but no sound came out. He cleared his throat. "No," he said. Candles burned in the upstairs parlor, where we had planned the death of the overseer. An oil lantern swayed in the breeze on the gallery. All of this light coalesced and began to shimmer, as though a golden presence hovered above me, suspended in the stairwell, softly entangled with the railings, curling and contracting like smoke. "Listen, keep your eyes wide," Lestat whispered to me, his lips moving against my neck. I remember that the moment of his lips raised the hair all over my body, sent a shock of sensation through my body that was not unlike the pleasure of passion. He mused, his right fingers slightly curled beneath his chin, the first finger appearing to lightly stroke it. The result was that within minutes I was weak to paralysis, panic-stricken. I discovered I could not even will myself to speak. Lestat still held me, of course, and his arm was like the weight of an iron bar. I felt his teeth withdraw with such a keenness that the 2 puncture wounds seemed enormous, lined with pain. And now he bent over my helpless head, and, taking his right hand off me, bit his own wrist. The blood flowed down upon my shirt and coat, and he watched it with a narrow, gleaming eye. It seemed an eternity that he watched it, and that shimmer of light now hung behind his head like the backdrop of an apparition. I think that I knew what he meant to do even before he did it, and I was waiting in my helplessness as if I'd been waiting for years. He pressed his bleeding wrist to my mouth, said firmly, a little impatiently, "Louis, drink." And I did. "Steady, Louis, and hurry," he whispered to me a number of times. I drank, sucking the blood out of the holes, experiencing for the first time since infancy the special pleasures of sucking nourishment, the body focused with the mind upon one vital source. Then something happened. The vampire sat back, a slight frown on his face. "How pathetic it is to describe these things which can't truly be described," he said, his voice low almost to a whisper. The boy sat as if frozen. "I saw nothing but that light then as I drew blood. And then this next thing was sound. A dull roar at first, and then a pounding like the pounding of a drum, growing louder and louder, as if some enormous creatures were coming up on one slowly through a dark and alien forest, pounding as he came, a huge drum. And then there came the pounding of another drum, as if another giant were coming yards behind him, and each giant, intent on his own drum, gave no notice to the rhythm of the other. The sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to fill not just my hearing, but all my senses, to be throbbing in my lips and fingers, in the eye, in the flesh of my temples, in my veins, above all in my veins, drum, and then the other drum, and then Lestat pulled his wrist free suddenly, and I opened my eyes and checked myself in a moment of reaching for his wrist, grabbing it, forcing it back to my mouth at all costs. I checked myself because I realized that the drum was my heart, and the second drum had been his. The vampire sighed. "Do you understand?" The boy began to speak, and then he shook his head. "No, I mean I do," he said. I mean I... "Of course," said the vampire, looking away. Wait, said the boy in a welter of excitement. The tape is almost gone. I have to turn it over." The vampire watched patiently as he changed it. "What happened then?" the boy asked. His face was moist, and he wiped it hurriedly with his handkerchief. "I saw as a vampire," said the vampire. His voice now slightly detached. It seemed almost distracted. Then he drew himself up. Lestat was standing at the foot of the stairs, and I saw him as I could not possibly have seen him before. He had seemed so white to me before, starkly white, so that in the night he was almost luminous. And now I saw him filled with his own life and own blood. He was radiant, not luminous, and then I saw that not only Lestat had changed, but all things had changed. It was as if I had only just been able to see colors and shapes for the first time. I was so enthralled with the buttons on Lestat's black coat that I looked at nothing else for a long time. Then Lestat began to laugh, and I heard his laughter as I had heard nothing else before. His heart I still heard like the beating of a drum, and now came this metallic laughter. It was confusing, each sound running into the next sound like the mingling reverberations of bells, until I learned to separate the sounds, and then they overlapped, each soft but distinct, increasing but discreet, peals of laughter. The vampire smiled with delight. Peals of bells. "Stop looking at my buttons," Lestat said. "Go out there into the trees. Rid yourself of all human waste in your body, and don't fall so madly in love with the night that you lose your way." That, of course, was a wise command. When I saw the moon on the flagstones, I became so enamored with it that I must have spent an hour there. I passed my brother's oratory without so much as a thought of him, and standing among the cottonwood and oaks, I heard the night as if it were a chorus of whispering women, all beckoning me to their breasts. As for my body, it was not yet totally converted, and as soon as I became the least accustomed to the sounds and sights, it began to ache. All my human fluids were being forced out of me. I was dying as a human, yet completely alive as a vampire, and with my awakened senses I had to preside over the death of my body with a certain discomfort, and then, finally, fear. I ran back up to the steps to the parlor where Lestat was already at work on the plantation papers, going over the expenses and profits for the last year. "You're a rich man," he said to me when I came in. "Something's happening to me," I shouted. "You're dying, that's all. Don't be a fool. Don't you have any oil lamps? All this money and you can't afford whale oil except for that lantern. Bring me that lantern." "Dying," I shouted. "Dying." "It happens to everyone," he persisted, refusing to help me. As I look back on this, I still despise him for it. Not because I was afraid, but because he might have drawn my attention to these changes with reverence. He might have calmed me and told me I might watch my death with the same fascination which I had watched and felt the night. But he didn't. Lestat was never the vampire I am. Not at all. The vampire did not say this boastfully. He said it as if he would truly have had it otherwise. "Alors," he sighed. "I was dying fast, which meant that my capacity for fear was diminishing as rapidly. I simply regret I was not more attentive to the process. Lestat was being a perfect idiot. "Oh, for the love of hell," he began shouting. "Do you realize I've made no provision for you? What a fool I am." I was tempted to say, "Yes, you are," but I didn't. "You'll have to bed down with me this morning. I haven't prepared you a coffin." And that's where we'll leave it for today. Alright, so that's another 10 pages of interview with the vampire. So what's some of the interesting things that we came across in those past 10 pages? And one of the first things is, the very beginning, is we see a scene that is one of the first instances of a mirroring of Dracula to be found in the text. That being Lestat's visitation of Louis in his bedchamber, a scene which is quite reminiscent of the way Dracula visits both Lucy and Mina in their bedchambers respectively, but what this is most reminiscent of is probably his visitation and subsequent, basically, seduction of Mina in her bedchamber. And I guess one of the things we have to think about in this regard is, why is it that the vampire, and in this instance, Lestat is specifically visiting Louis in his bedchamber? Well, there's the obvious answer, which is, first of all, it's nighttime, and vampires come out at night, and people are generally in their bed at night. And also, Louis is quite ill as a result of his attack, and so he's kind of bound to this location. That's, an obvious answer. But if we look at it symbolically, we have two particular things I think we can look at in this regard. First, we have the vulnerability of bedchambers. It's why a lot of horror stories have stuff about being in bed, because being in bed is where it's one of the most vulnerable places you can be, because you're sleeping, and it's only natural to be scared while you're asleep in case something comes and eats you. But there's also, I think, this notion of sexual intimacy, which would be tied to a bedchamber. And especially when we consider the grander sexual implications, particularly of the vampire's feeding practices, this visitation of Louis in his bedchamber by Lestat is indicative, or in some way symbolic, of the greater kind of sexual desire, or which Lestat is expressing or feeling towards Louis in this regard. And the bedchamber obviously being symbolic of sexual intimacy. And more to the point, this kind of turns into something much more sinister when you consider the context of Lestat's visitation and Lestat's turning of Louis. Because the feeding is obviously described, and there's a description of it feeling like, the pleasure of passion. It feels sexually arousing to those fed upon and those feeding. But this becomes a lot more sinister when you consider that Louis doesn't outright say he didn't really consent to this encounter, but he definitely questions his capacity to consent. He doesn't say that he didn't want it, but he says that he didn't really know if he wanted it, or that he wasn't really willing. He couldn't say no, is his ultimate conclusion. And he does admit that Lestat probably would have killed him if he refused these advances. And this is made even more menacing by the point we come to at the very, very end of the section we've read today, where Lestat has intentionally not set out another coffin for Louis. Essentially what he says at the very end is, "Oh, what a shame, you'll have to sleep with me tonight," which, taken in the grander context of this sexual predation on the behalf of Lestat, it becomes even more menacing. Lestat is essentially acting as a literal and a sexual predator in this regard. He wants to exploit Louis in this regard. And so in this sexual exploitation of Louis by Lestat, we have yet another way that Lestat is basically acting like a parasite. He's trying to just drain Louis of everything he can get from him, and build a sense of emotional dependency. If you look, we're going to constantly try and draw parallels between Lestat's treatment of Louis and this kind of abusive relationship that he's going for. Because what's the first thing Lestat does when he turns Louis into a vampire? He doesn't, comfort him. He doesn't try to teach him about his ways. The first thing Lestat does is send Louis off into the forest and then go and look through all his stuff. When Louis comes back, Lestat is looking through his money and complaining. And when Louis expresses any concerns, Lestat just kind of dismisses them and tells him he's an idiot. And then goes, "All right, time to sleep with me now." This is all very, very abusive, very manipulative behavior. And we tie this in with the killing of the overseer. Why does Lestat need the overseer to die? Well, there's sort of this overarching thing where it's just kind of played off by nothing, that this overseer needs to die to gain control of the plantation. And I understand there was probably some contractual limitation in place in this regard, where the overseer would have to be gotten rid of somehow. But why does the overseer need to be killed? Well, Louis justifies it in Lestat's terms, where Louis has to see death. But I think there's something much more sinister at play here, because you could definitely use some contractual finicking to get rid of the overseer. But no, the overseer instead has to be killed, and he doesn't just have to be killed, he has to be killed in a brutal way. Lestat goes to him, kills him, and it specifically mentions that he takes a long time to die, which is ironic because there's a lot of death that takes place in this book that just kind of happens. They just drink them and then discard them, and there's no real dwelling upon it. But this mortal takes a long time to die, and he suffers in the process. And then Lestat brings the body out to the river and makes Louis beat it up. He makes Louis undergo this intense, traumatic experience. And what I was thinking while I was reading through it that time is that kind of forced traumatic experience as a kind of rite of passage. It feels like a rite of passage for Louis to witness this death and engage in this trauma. It kind of mirrors a kind of like terrorist bonding exercise where you'd have like a lot of like terrorist organizations have initiations where they'll have their newest recruits engage in some kind of trauma-inducing act of violence, because acting in these traumatic ways, having to perform these horrible acts together with someone else, creates this camaraderie, this bond with that other person, so that even though you've committed a horrible act, and even that person has made you commit a horrible act, you feel oddly attached to them because they've been through the same thing you have, and it very like suddenly builds this camaraderie, this sense of belonging. And I feel like there's some degree of that in Lestat's behavior, some desire to manipulate Louis on this very, very deep emotional level to essentially traumatize him to the degree where his only choice is to cling on to Lestat. I don't think Lestat's a very good person, and I think this is, that goes without saying. Lestat's horribly, horribly evil. But when you look at his character, there are so many things that that just highlight him as this gaslighting, manipulative, horrible, horrible creature. And we just see Louis consistently victimized in this regard. And, Lestat is kind of idealized despite this. And I think that's one of the things I want to go through and point out as they come up in this novel, how just villainous and nasty and horrible Lestat is, and how consistently he just tries to belittle everyone around him. And I think it only gets worse as far as this novel is concerned. And I think it makes Lestat a very interesting character, provided you're only looking at him in regards to his utter repulsive evil. Because Louis is definitely a victim in this story. Even though Louis himself is not a very good person, which I'll get into a bit more when I start to talk about the slaves soon, because don't worry, I'm not going to ignore the fact that Louis is a slave owner, and subsequently that has a massive, massive impact upon my perception of his moral standing as a human being, even if we consider that normal for the time. There's still a lot to be said in that regard, because the way he thinks about his slaves is very, very bad. But yeah, that's just some analysis on the past 10 pages we've read. I think like the turning Louis into a vampire is a really, really interesting section, so I'm glad I got to talk about it. And I will see you again tomorrow for more reading and more analysis. So until then, take care.